absolutely promise the Fallout video will be the very next thing you'll see here on the channel, but Awakened Realms, the publisher of Tainted Grail Conquest, had this conversation apparently.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
And they reached out to me, gave me a review code, and asked me to play the early access version of Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon, which was developed by Questline and published by Awakened Realms. And it has been available for purchase on Steam since May 30th, and you can get it for $29.99 right now. Unofficially, I have to say that I still can't believe the publisher of a game that I actually like reached out to me and asked me to review their new game, so let's get to it. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumping for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And as you also know, I rate games according to a series of categories that encompass what, in my opinion, are the most important aspects of a game, depending on the genre of the title at hand. And this time, we have the early access version, and this is something that you should keep in mind at all times, of Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon, an open-world RPG in the tradition of Skyrim or Outward that takes place in an Arthurian dark fantasy setting. And when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are especially important. Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon uses a classless system, which means that there aren't any pre-made classes or archetypes for you to choose from. But before we get into whether or not this system suits the game, and before I share my personal thoughts about the character progression system, I'd like to tell you about its most basic elements. First, you have attributes. These are basic stats like strength, endurance, dexterity, and so on and so forth. You improve these by getting experience and leveling, and every time you level, you'll get 1 or 2 points to allocate to the attribute of your choice. Allocating points to endurance, for example, increases stats like stamina and health, while adding points to strength decreases the stamina needed to perform an attack or a blocking move, and it also increases your damage with melee weapons. Then you have skills. In this game, skills are governed by attributes, so you can only acquire these skills if you have a good enough level of their governing attribute. In order to unlock these skills, you need to assign skill points, of course, and you get a skill point every 2 levels. And lastly, you have proficiencies. This is a mixed bag of talents that goes from sneaking to your one-hand weapon expertise to crafting disciplines such as cooking, alchemy, and handcrafting. And these work exactly as they do in games like Skyrim, which means that the more you do them, the better you get at them. There are also many spells that you can use in this game, but they aren't a part of a skill tree, so there is no hierarchy to them, and you do not unlock them by leveling. You find scrolls while you're out there exploring, and you equip them just as you would any weapon, and you can have several sets of weapons. Their efficiency, though, and the frequency with which you can use them depends on your spirituality attribute. And there are, of course, spirituality-dependent skills that improve your magic-wielding prowess significantly. And that's it, that's how your character progression works in Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon in a nutshell. But we have often said in this channel that an RPG's character creation and progression system is only as good as the freedom it gives the player to go on about the game's challenges in his or her own way. And those challenges in Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon come in the form of combat, exploration, questing, and what I like to call seamlessly integrated puzzle solving. Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon's character creation and progression system focuses heavily on the combat end of things, but it seems a little bit inconsequential in other aspects of the game such as exploration, puzzle solving, and even questing. Although it does try to do something on the questing end of things, it gets A for effort, I suppose. But I also felt this to be largely the case with games like Skyrim or Morrowind, so if you didn't think this was an issue in those other games, it shouldn't bother you in Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon either. At the beginning of the game, you create a character, you give it a name, and you choose a few superficial attributes like what kind of old face you want to have, and whether you want to roleplay as a dude who's been going to the gym for 8 months, or as Fato Morgano, he who threatens to end the existence of all Dorito bags everywhere. I felt represented, I give it a 10 out of 10 here. Representation matters and all that. Unfortunately, that was the last time I saw my character in the game, because Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon uses a first-person perspective, so if I were you, I wouldn't invest too much time on this screen. I guess this criticism isn't entirely fair, as you get to see your character every time you go to your inventory screen. But although that is all there is for you to do in the character creation interface per se, you'll soon get the chance to further tune your character to your preferred approach. As soon as the game starts, some guy, presumably a torturer who's come to force a few more answers out of you about this or that, starts asking you questions, not unlike the ones you get asked at the beginning of Morrowind. Don't get too excited though, the dude only gets the chance to ask you a couple of questions before the interview is, cut short. But that's enough time for you to tell the game that you want to be a soldier, or a hunter, or a battle mage. These choices grant you extra bonuses in a series of combat and non-combat skills. If you tell this guy that you are a hunter who was out there gathering resources, for example, you get a bonus to cooking and alchemy. But this is by no means a choice of class. Like we said, there are no classes or archetypes in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. Just as it happens in games like Skyrim or Morrowind, you have a broad array of possibilities, and you may choose to try to become a jack of all trades, or you can hyper-focus on the thing you want your character to be. But in Skyrim, for example, you get a series of combat and non-combat disciplines, and each of them has its own unique talent tree. And if you wish to acquire a certain skill, you must have mastered the one that comes before in its talent tree. But in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, like we said, skills depend on their governing attribute, and you are currently looking at the skills that are governed by the endurance attribute. Because I raised my endurance attribute to 11, I unlocked the possibility to acquire these skills. This means that attributes are the marrow of your build in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. But if you look at these skills, you'll notice that all of them are passive benefits. They are flat increments of stats like stamina or HP, or faster recovery rates, or increments of X percentage of damage, or something along those lines. There are no actual skills for you to learn. It would have been nice to have skills like Cleave or Shield Rush or Disarm, or at least perks and stances like the ones you have in Skyrim. If you're a magic user, you'll be pleased to know that there are spells to be found in the world of Avalon. And these spells may be equipped as though they were weapons, and they are pretty diverse. There are direct damage spells, summoning spells, healing spells, etc. But you don't have melee combat equivalents, and that means that melee players will probably find themselves using the same moves again and again and again throughout the entire game, at least for this early access version of the game. And it's not like the enemy AI in this game will force you out of your comfort zone and demand that you use complex combat tactics, but we'll talk about that later. Some attributes are also used during conversations with NPCs. I've found perception to be the most widely used attribute in these situations, but I find it frustrating that attribute-dependent dialogue options are very few in number, and when you do get them, choosing them over the rest of the options won't have too much of an impact on the outcome of a conversation or even a quest. It's also worth mentioning at this point that in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, once you commit to a quest, there is almost always only one way to get it done. Quests aren't designed in a way that allows you to sneak and steal or convince or fight your way out of a situation depending on what you are good at. If this game says a quest is about talking, then you'll have no choice but to bump those gums with the NPC in question. And similarly, if the quest is about killing someone, chances are you won't be able to sweet talk your way out of it. There are a few quasi-exceptions to this. In some quests, you do get a couple of alternatives, and some of them even entail attribute-dependent dialogue choices that allow you to get things done in a way other than the default way. And those are hands down the best quests in the game so far. In Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, as it happens in Skyrim for example, jumping around, sneaking about, and sprinting from place to place will increase your proficiencies in those areas. I am particularly not a fan at all of this mechanic. It is realistic, because the more you do something, the better you get at it. But as a game mechanic, I find it distracting. Your talents for cooking, crafting, and alchemy work much in the same way. These are secondary mechanics that you have in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, like you do in so many other open world RPGs, and we will be talking about them later like we usually do. But I'll just say at this point that not once did I run into a recipe that I couldn't use because I didn't have the right level of cooking or alchemy. I think your level of cooking or alchemy increases the efficiency of the thing you're crafting, but I didn't find skill progression in this particular respect to be relevant, or at least it isn't yet, though this may very well change in future updates. Now let's talk about your character's build in this game and the impact it has on the exploration end of things. I feel like this was a wasted opportunity. In some isometric CRPGs like Divinity Original Sin 2, your combat skills, if used creatively, can be used to gain access to places that would otherwise be impossible to get to. And the best thing about this is that all those places that you can only access by using your skills creatively have a sweet piece of loot to reward you for your boldness and creativity. In some games you have talents like Detect Secret Door or something like that, which allows a character in your party to perceive an entrance to a room that would have remained undetected and therefore unexplored if no one in the party had had that talent. In some other games, it's attributes like Perception that allow your character to detect secret doors and concealed rooms. And in some other games, you just get a straightforward skill check. And you could say that Tainted Grail is not this kind of RPG. And yes, you'd be right, but Dragon's Dogma more or less is. And in that game, there are areas that you can only access if you have enough dexterity to make the jump, or if you are a mage and you have the skill to conjure up an ice platform that you can climb to and use as an intermediate step. And some of these areas that you can only access if you have the right skills are pretty freaking big and filled with loot, enemies, and quests. In some cases, these are just alternative ways into areas that you would otherwise get to by following a long, perilous road. But the fact that you have a shortcut that you can access because you have a certain skill adds value to both your build and the exploration aspect of the game. In Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, you have the agility proficiency, which makes you jump slightly higher with every level. It would have been cool if there had been places that you could only access if you had a good enough agility level, or a good enough level of perception, and maybe give the player a little piece of loot to reward his or her spirit of adventure. While stuff like this may be added further down the road, it is still something you don't see in this game, or at least I personally didn't find anything quite like this. So Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon's character creation and progression system offers a wide array of possibilities to those who find their fun in playing and replaying the game with a different build to see how things play out on the combat end of things. Its classless system offers a great deal of freedom, and we can all appreciate that. But those who expect their build to have an impact on aspects of the game other than combat, like questing or exploration, will probably be a little bit disappointed with this one. Gameplay. If you have been watching the footage that I have been showing so far in this video, you're probably thinking, okay, so it's Arthurian Skyrim, I get it. And yes, you wouldn't be too far off in that assessment. So if you love or hate the Elder Scrolls series, that should be a pretty decent measure of how much you are going to like or dislike this game. But although Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon reminds me of Skyrim in many ways, many more than I would like, it also has its own thing going on, and its own merits and problems that we can talk about. But always keep in mind that mine is but one opinion amongst many. I will remind you that there are other people who have been around on YouTube for much longer than I have and are much more experienced, and I would say much more knowledgeable than I am. So I very emphatically recommend, if you have not done so yet, that you check out some of their videos. I will recommend ESO's video in particular, because when it comes to open world RPGs, this is the man you want to check out. I will leave a link to his video in the description section down below, and while you're at it, you might also want to check his videos on Outward. They are the best videos on that game. Plus the guy is too freaking authentic, enthusiastic, and likable. And you can also check Wolfhard FPS's video on Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. He is always a solid choice if you wish to know more about an RPG, so I'll leave a link to his video in the description section down below. But now that you are here, you might as well watch this video all the way to the end, right? Well, here's what I think about Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. If you are an RPG guy or gal, and if you like the 3D open world variant of the genre, this is a game that you might want to try out, guys, because there aren't too many decent games in this ballpark if you ask me, and I am pretty sure that if this type of game is your jam, you must have already exhausted all the other decent options that are out there, as lengthy as most of them are. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is competently put together, and when it's firing on all cylinders, it's actually pretty good, which leads me to believe that it will only get better with every update during this early access period. But that doesn't mean it's perfect now, nor that it will be perfect in the future, of course. And I have my share of issues with it. Some of them are big, some of them you could call nitpicks, but I have to share them with you all the same. The biggest problem that I have with Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is that it seems to have drawn too much inspiration from Skyrim. Maybe the developers, and maybe some of you, regard Skyrim as a first-in-class open-world RPG, but I certainly don't share this opinion, and I also feel like they copied some of the problems that that game had along with its main premise. A lot of what we see and experience in this game, in this stage at least, is very derivative of stuff that we have already seen in other games. But that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. After all, the same thing could be said of games like Pillars of Eternity or the Pathfinder games. Many of the features, game mechanics, themes, and even quests that we experienced in those games were pulled straight out of Baldur's Gate. But the reason why this Me Too approach didn't work for me in this game, and I am talking about Me Too as we understand it in marketing, not activism, just in case it needs to be said. Well, the reason why the Me Too approach didn't work for me is that I never understood what the game's main focus was supposed to be. Outward, for example, makes it abundantly clear from the get-go that the game's main focus is the exploration aspect of the game. Everything else in Outward, questing, combat, even character progression are secondary, and they feel like things that are there to elevate the exploration aspect of the game, to make it matter more. Take for example your character's build in that game. If you want to have some of the best skills the game has to offer, you want to visit a guy who lives somewhere about here.
One does not simply walk
Into this guy's house, no. You can only reach the region where his tower is located by taking a long walk to this place, then venturing into this obscure abandoned ruin, plagued with monsters and other hazards, coming out on the other end, taking a long, likely eventful stride through this perilous plain until you find the dude's tower, and chances are that you'll have to camp at least once during this lengthy trip. And to top things off, you don't even know there is a guy here who can teach you stuff. You find him, that's right, by exploring the world to see what it has to offer. And of course he doesn't have a quest marker or anything like that. If the game's focus had been questing, then you probably would have not had to embark upon this lengthy journey or kick about the game's every location to see if there was anyone willing to teach you anything. You probably would have gotten these skills as rewards for completing quests. If the game's focus had been its combat aspect, you probably would have unlocked these skills by simply leveling up and clicking on their icons in a talent tree. Similarly, in Outward, the very best items in the game are hidden away in remote dungeons that you don't have to go to as part of one of the game's main quests. Also, the game doesn't have quest markers, it does not show your current location in the area map, and most importantly, it does not have a fast travel feature. And this is not because the game is purposefully trying to not hold your hand, or because it's trying to be difficult, although that may be a byproduct. It's because if the game had had these features, they would have completely defeated the game's purpose, and they would have been in contradiction with the game's main focus, which is again the exploration aspect of the experience. Hell, even the game's name is telling of what the focus of the game is supposed to be. But in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, I felt like the game shifted its focus in ways that prevented any of the aspects of the game from standing out as the main driving factor. In basketball, for example, there's a player in your team that you're supposed to consider the #1 option when you are in the offense, the guy you have to give the ball to if you can. It doesn't mean you always have to pass the ball to him, but that's the guy you want to look at first when you have possession of the ball. Outward, for example, has mediocre combat, and quests aren't exactly groundbreaking, but we can forgive all of this because the game is always first and foremost about discovery and exploration, and everything else adds to this. And of course, I'm not saying combat or questing have to be bad for exploration to be good. You just need a focus. Now, in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, the very first thing you have to do in the game is escape a dungeon. You have a clearly defined quest that takes place in a relatively small area. There's almost no exploration to be done in this initial area, and there's a clearly defined path that you have to follow. There are some bad guys that you can kill, and some letters, journal pages, and books that you can read that provide context to your current situation. But you have this dude Caradoc telling you what you have to do every step of the way. And when you go into this mystical realm, because it's part of your quest's critical path, you run into this entity who gives you a quest almost immediately. So at this point, I thought, okay, this game is first and foremost about questing and advancing a story. Now, I understand this is meant to be like a tutorial act, and as such, it does a fine job. There's not too much going on to overwhelm you, it effectively introduces most game mechanics, it sets the tone of the game, and it also starts with a small mission that is very important to you personally. I mean, it doesn't get much more personal than escaping a prison, and I will give the game credit for this. By the time you hit the 20-minute mark, you have already been sucked into a mysterious otherworldly realm, given the superhuman power to slow time, seen titans spin the wheels of some ancient cryptic machine, gone through portals, and read horrifying stories about the weirdness and the Red Death disease. Man, up until this point, this game is busy. But this initial moment also sort of sells you that this is going to be a heavily quest-driven game. But immediately after you cross the portal over to this new location, the game will let you know that it expects you to meet Caradoc somewhere down at the beach. There's even a little checkbox to further emphasize the to-do nature of this task. But at the same time, the game gives you the freedom to explore this new location however you wish. And there are corpses that you can loot, altars with offerings that you can loot, improvised abandoned shelters that you can loot, and a couple of diaries and notes that you can read and loot. You can even jump into the sea and swim around the island or climb to the top of some of the hills, but don't bother doing any of this because the game has no intentions of rewarding your exploration endeavors in any significant way. There aren't, for example, any NPCs ready to offer you an alternative way to escape the island without having to owe Caradoc a favor. There aren't any items to be found that will give you even the slightest edge in combat. There are no new secret quests for you to unlock, nothing. So why give us all this freedom to explore this open area when all you want us to do is go meet Caradoc? It's like giving your new puppy a name like Stay, and then saying, "Come here, Stay." That's going to confuse the poor creature, dude. So, by this point in the game, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that walking about and leaving no stone unturned is not a thing you should be focusing on as a player, because the game isn't really willing to reward you for doing this, but it does prompt you to make haste and go to the next quest marker to get things done. But not long after that, the game changes gears drastically. A couple of minutes later, I found myself in a place filled with eye-catching landmarks that were begging to be explored, and very little motivation to follow the game's main quest. We'll get into why later. So the focus of this game is exploration after all, not questing. Alright, well, I'm down. So at this point I decided to ditch the questing and focus on the exploration. And yes, this is the aspect that I had the most fun with in the game. There were secrets to be found, cool spells and recipes, underwater hidden dungeons where there was something monumentally evil going on, etc. Cool, not outward. It could have been if they had focused on the exploration aspect of the game, but cool. The problem was that my Dora the Exploradora initiatives sometimes ended in frustration because I didn't have the right quest to do what I was meant to do at some of these wonderful places. So I was forced to go back to this stronghold to see if anyone had anything that needed to be done in any of these places. There's a lot of combat to be done in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon too. There are lengthy dungeons filled with baddies who need killing, and on the surface, because most enemies have a wide aggro range, it's not easy to circumvent fights, and once you engage in combat, you cannot escape by cheesing it. The bottom line here is that combat is very much a thing in this game, and from time to time you'll get the impression that it is the thing you are meant to care the most about. And I wouldn't blame you, because the game's character progression system seems to focus almost completely on the combat aspect of the game. And speaking of combat, I'd like to mention that almost everyone is hostile in this game, which is a bit stressful because there are some people you actually have to talk to, and it's not easy to tell them apart from the bad guys. So I guess it's a good policy to shoot first and ask questions later. But regardless of how much you engage in exploration and combat, the game sort of expects you to spend a large chunk of your time at this place, listening to people's rants and offering to help them with all sorts of things. This is the biggest and most populated place in the game, and it's filled with quests for you to do. So yes, I think it's definitely about questing. Or not, maybe. Come here, Stay. Unfortunately, to me, the gameplay mix, rather than feeling like one solid cohesive whole, felt a bit like the game wanted to do everything everywhere all at once, but without ever committing to one of these things as the turnstone of the gameplay mix. But now that the rant is over, let's get a bit into every individual aspect of the gameplay mix, shall we? Questing in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is not terrible, but it's far from being great. These are some of the things you'll have to do in this game. Getting a warm coat for a guardsman who's freezing off his rear end because the blacksmith doesn't want to make one for him. Collecting teeth from undead creatures who roam around a certain location and giving them to some dude so that he can prove to his friends that he's no coward. Finding a way to keep seagulls from crapping all over an angry guard who hates birds. And making a bowl of soup for someone using his mother's recipe. And yes, I cherry-picked some of the worst quests in the game, but the fact remains that the developers of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon felt like these quests, all of them, were worthy of being included in their game. And I'm okay with one or two quests like this, but not these many. And there are more interesting quests in which there's more at stake than someone not coming off as a coward in front of his mates. But on an operative level, they are structured as linear multi-stage to-do list of tasks that can only be done the way in which they are meant to. You never run into unexpected events that change your mission's parameters, you never meet people who offer a different perspective on the mission at hand and make you change your opinions about what must be done, and like we mentioned earlier, there are no sneak and steal or fight or convince types of situations. If the game expects you to fight to get things done, then you'll have to fight. There'll be no way to sneak and steal or talk your way to success. And if I'm honest with you, I got bored with some of these quests because they were utterly mundane, and on top of that, I really didn't have to pay attention to anything anyone said because nothing they ever said was ever actually needed to complete the to-do list that pass for quests in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. Now there are some notable exceptions to this. The last voyage of Andraste was a pretty cool quest, and there was this other quest that required me to evict the current tenants of a certain manor. This last quest pretty much beat the sod out of my expectations, even if something unnecessarily weird happened at the end of the quest. I also felt like the quests that dealt with more human issues, like a character's feeling of guilt for what he did to his friend, or the hatred that this other character felt towards non-locals, had a lot of potential, but said potential was undermined by the subpar quality of the writing in this game, which we will get into later on. I found the quests to be much more fun when I wasn't tracking them and when I didn't use fast travel to move around, but I'm sure that's just a me thing coming from an old dude who's stuck in the old days. But I thought the biggest offender in the questing department was the main quest itself. I think the game totally botched this one, and we'll talk about it when we talk about the game's story and lore, but not having a strong personal motivation or even a reason for the main character to pursue the game's main objective really hurts the fun factor and the immersion aspect of your game. And unfortunately, this is something that happens in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, in my opinion. Then you have combat, which is also not terrible, but not great either. Enemy AI isn't particularly sharp, and there are still many exploits that you can abuse to cheese many of the hardest combat encounters, but this is something that'll surely get updated during this early access period. On an operative level, I feel like it is serviceable, but still a little bit clunky. I mean, compared to any Piranha Bytes game is freaking Sekiro. And it's not without its cool little things that you don't see every day in this particular RPG subgenre, like a perfect parry mechanic which drains stamina from enemies, and a nice little quick dash that you can use to evade attacks or to score easy hits and even go in for the kill. But as a melee combatant, I found a consistent formula to defeat all enemies, regardless of the type of enemy they were, by doing the same thing again and again. And this is not a good thing. Your enemies telegraph most of their attacks, so you have plenty of time to backstep or dash back to evade the incoming hit, and then walk in or dash forward to deal a couple of blows. And quick weapons like daggers make this technique easy to pull off because they are much faster and require a lot less stamina to use. Exploration is probably the best aspect of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon's gameplay mix. It's great because the world is intricate and it's filled with interesting places that feel like they have a story, and in some cases you actually get to know the story behind these places. The game even has its fair share of secret underground and underwater locations that are teeming with lore in the form of abandoned manuscripts and diaries, and this is where the game truly shines. Some of these places are terrifying, and if you pay attention to what's going on, you'll easily gather that there is something monumentally evil afoot. And if you take the time to read some of the diaries and letters that are lying around in some of these places, you'll get an unparalleled feeling of anxiety and horror as you are finally able to piece together what's going on. The gaming experience in some of these locations was an unmitigated 10 out of 10 for me, even if I can tell that some of these places aren't finished yet. But I think that exploration as a whole is still a few leagues away from the level achieved by games like Outward or even Elex. But this is still an early access build, and a very ambitious one at that, so I am very excited about what the game might have in store for us in the future in the exploration department. This game also has what I like to call seamless puzzle solving. There's not too much of it, but you do get a few treats here and there. There are, for example, some altars throughout the island in which you can leave an offering. The key here is figuring out what to leave as an offering. And if you nose around enough, you'll come by this information and you'll be able to leave a proper offering and get a nice little item in return for worshipping your deity like a true devout believer. As a whole, I am a little worried about the lack of focus in the gameplay mix and the railroady quest design, because these aren't things that you can fix with patches. But on the other hand, I think gameplay in this early access build of Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is surprisingly solid. It is mostly fun, it definitely gets better as it goes, and I have no doubts that aspects such as combat and exploration will get ironed out even further during this early access period. Story and lore. Tainted Grail Conquest grabbed the tried and true Slay the Spire formula and used it as the core foundation for an impressive action RPG with deeply immersive lore and exquisite writing. And while it had cool RPG elements on top of some very solid card mechanics, the best thing about the game was the way in which it weaved a complex narrative around the theme of guild. It also made very clever use of the Arthurian myth to paint a desolate scenario that was almost Kafkian in nature. The game took place in some sort of dark limbo, and your surroundings were twisted and weird to the point that you couldn't quite tell if your character was alive or dead. And he was trapped along with many other characters who roamed around this ethereal plane, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were no longer alive. They were also stuck in pointless pursuits of goals that might have made sense when they were alive, but to which there was no point anymore. They were trapped in a half existence with no possibility of redemption or end. And you didn't have to be a genius to gather that the point the game sought to make was that these characters were living in a hell of their own making, a hell they had built upon their own feeling of guilt. and I confess that some of these stories managed to break me, like the story of the child Futhark and his mom, or this girl's story. And you also had brilliantly written characters like you don't ever see in video games, like the Elder Archer, whose legs ended in roots that stretched into the ground and formed an ever-burning bonfire, all of which was a metaphor of guilt, presented as a gnarled root that won't let go and is always burning. Or the huge abomination who walked about with people sticking out of its belly, because in life he used to be a despicable person who gained notoriety by claiming other people's merits as his own. And it was all there to make the subtle point that you escape your personal hell by helping others go through theirs. The way in which the story was structured and the language used in Tainted Grail Conquest felt adequately ancient. Characters were stoic in an old-fashioned way, and their dilemmas didn't sound like they were written by a privileged Gen Zer who spends half of his life on Twitter and thinks working extra hours is the end of the world. The narration in this game was capable of transporting me to a world that felt nothing like my mundane, modern-day, everyday reality, and I cannot speak highly enough of it because of this. But why am I talking about Tainted Grail Conquest in this video? Well, I felt like I had to, because to say that I was shocked, and not in a good way, with the writing in Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon would be a monumental understatement. I can scarcely believe these games were made by the same people. I mean, don't get me wrong, next to games like Solasta or the Pathfinder games, this is Dostoevsky levels of writing, but compared to Tainted Grail Conquest, it felt mundane. The language felt excessively modern, to the point that some of the expressions used would even feel out of place if they were used in a film or show that took place in the 70s or 80s. And the language being too modern isn't even the worst problem with the writing in this game. I often felt like every time I had a conversation with an NPC, the game was all hell bent on getting to the part where said NPCs would ask something of me as soon as possible. Take for example the conversation you have with this dude. Not 10 seconds of conversation go by before he straight out tells you that he wants you to cook some soup using his mother's recipe. Is this what this guy is thinking about all day long? Is this the first thing he tells a complete stranger when he meets him for the first time? But this time I am not cherry picking. This is a representative example, one of many examples in the game. Even this guy, who is probably the most important NPC in the game, rushes to the point he wishes to make every time he talks to you, as though he's scared of boring you with the details. And the same thing goes for 90% of the characters in this game. This feels unrealistic and immersion breaking. It feels as though these NPCs have no reason to exist beyond giving you a quest. When I heard the first NPC you meet in the game talk for the first time, I couldn't help but think, this doesn't sound like Tainted Grail Conquest. This sounds like something any NPC in any generic game would say. Then this guy comes along, kills the dude, and makes some remark about him smelling funny. Is this a Tainted Grail game or a Marvel movie? I thought. But then I started exploring the dungeon and picking up and reading the journal entries that some of the prisoners had left behind, notes about the gruesome experiments that took place in the prison, and the books that people kept around for spiritual fulfillment and entertainment. And I got a comforting sense of relief. Yes, this feels more like the Tainted Grail I know, I thought. You could even piece together the story behind these skeletons by reading the journal entries left behind by someone named Katrine, and the notes on the experiments that were performed on her. That felt like proper good old Tainted Grail writing right there. These pieces of writing were short, concise, useful, but they were also written in a way that felt consistent with the game's lore, setting, and time. They told important details about the place where you were being held prisoner, the Red Death Plague, and the nature of the experiment. Some were even hilarious pieces of medieval-style erotic literature. There's actually a whole series of this erotic fiction that narrates in detail, in hilarious detail, the sexual adventures of a character named Liliana.
Yes! This rules! I'm so down, bros.
I consider this in-game books to be top-tier video game humor. But this relief was short-lived because I eventually witnessed this conversation. And that's when every alarm in the cockpit went off. This conversation was painfully on the nose, to the point that it felt almost like a crude checklist of things the game wanted to communicate. These other two characters were also saved by Caradoc. Caradoc wants these two characters to help him kill King Arthur. Your main mission in the game is to kill King Arthur, and you are going to need to wield Excalibur to do so. These two characters do not believe Caradoc because Arthur has been dead for ages. You all have no choice but to do as Caradoc says, because there's no other way to leave the island. After this cringe-versation is over, you then get the chance to have a brief one-on-one conversation with each of the characters involved. They tell you about their tribes and places of origin, and a couple of things about how they got captured and tortured. And that's it. The game prompts you to take a rest in the boat, and the next thing you know is that the prologue of the game is over and the first act of the game is about to begin. And guess what happens while the four of you are en route to Avalon on this boat? I bet you are not going to see this one coming. That's right, a storm wrecks your boat.
No way!
And the next thing you know is that you have been washed ashore along with some broken crates and barrels and the rest of the shipwreck. Yes, you don't see that ever happen in a video game, do you? Anyway, this is where the game actually begins. The thing is that Caradoc is nowhere to be found. He might even have died in the storm for all you know or care. And well, that is a problem. Because the way I see it, there is absolutely no reason for you to follow through with Caradoc's bidding anymore. I mean, you got on that boat in the first place because you had to escape the island asylum, and you probably didn't want to end up living in some precarious cave like that hermit whose diary you found while you were snooping around the island. But when you come to think of it, the only thing you were told is that you had to help Caradoc redeem Excalibur so that you could use it to kill King Arthur, but he never explained in detail why you had to do any of that. And it's not like you have a personal stake in the matter. You read about some pretty gruesome stuff about the spread of the Red Death back in the island, but you have no way of knowing for sure if any of it had to do with King Arthur or whether or not his death would bring an end to the plague or anything. The game makes a very good case for you to hate those Red Priest bastards who captured you. I mean, Katrine's story was brilliantly immersive and powerful, and the game topped it off with this heartbreaking sight. It doesn't get much more emotional and powerful than this. And you saw and read about the inhumane experiments these monsters were performing on innocent, defenseless people. But after an hour of playing the game, you leave the island and everything that had to do with it behind, and it's rarely ever mentioned again. So what was the point to all of this? The writers could have easily spun your initial experience as a prisoner and all these stories of torture you read about while you were still in prison into a powerful motivation for your character to do something about it. They could have left some clues for you to piece together and connect the dots of the Red Priests, the Red Death, and King Arthur to provide you with a goal and a solid motivation. But nope, you find yourself in Avalon with no motivation other than the promise you made to a complete stranger at a time in which you were desperate to leave an island to help him on a mission he didn't fully explain for reasons that are unknown to you and that are not even remotely close to being personal. Oh, but you do get a message at the top left-hand corner of your screen prompting you to go to the Horns of the South. Good enough, I guess. Compare this to a similar story that is actually good. I'm talking about Mask of the Betrayer, the first expansion for Neverwinter Nights 2. You wake up in an unknown place and soon you learn that you have been possessed by a demonic entity who is slowly consuming your soul and actual life, and also happens to be some ancient creature of prophecy who everyone wants to kill before it breaks loose into the world in its real form and ends up killing everyone. Talk about motivation and stakes for you and your enemies, man. I think I'll let my case rest for now, but I'll wrap this one up by saying that I was not impressed in the slightest with the story or the writing in this game, especially given how brilliant the first game was in both of these respects. And although this is an early access build, I really don't see how they can turn this one around. But then again, I encourage you to check out those other videos I mentioned, because I am well aware that this lengthy rant about the story may very well be a me thing. But well, this is my video after all, so this is the score I'm giving the game's story and lore so far. Companions lore-wise.
There aren't any!
But Is this a good or a bad thing? In my opinion, these open world games tend to have the worst companions. Elex, Skyrim, Fallout New Vegas, everyone who tags along in those games is bland, grey, and inconsequential at best, and straight out irritating at worst, except Rex. Their only purpose is to serve as pack mules and combat bots. I also think the one thing you want to nail in an open world game is the feeling of adventure, and I feel like the solo adventure works best for this. And one of these two is nowhere to be found when you wake up at the beach after the wreckage, which leads me to believe that he or she may join you later on in the game as a companion. I really hope they don't, and if they do, I hope they don't suck. But so far there aren't any companions, and I think that's a good thing. Companions gameplay-wise.
There aren't any!
Secondary mechanics and user experience. Secondary mechanics are a bit like the character creation and progression system in the sense that they are only good as their contribution to the game's core mechanics and its fun factor. And secondary mechanics are pretty useful in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. There is cooking, alchemy, and handcrafting to be done in this game, and I felt like they were all seamlessly integrated into the gameplay mix. Cooking is necessary in this game, because you need food to restore health and mana. You don't need a recipe to cook things. You can grab ingredients and just experiment to see what you get, just like you could in Outward. I confess that I let out a yes every time I found a new book of recipes while I was out there exploring the world, because it meant that I was going to be able to do something with a metric ton of cooking ingredients that I carried about with me at all times. And the exact same thing could be said about alchemy and crafting. There are no BS potions in this game. And I hate games in which you have a gazillion potions and you don't know what to do with 90% of them. I ended up using every potion I could get my hands on, and those special arrows you can craft at some point in the game make a world of difference. These books of recipes and crafting also contribute to make exploration matter. Finding a book of recipes in the corner end of nowhere feels like a proper reward for your Dora the Explorer efforts. This aspect of the game is still not in the same league as Skyrim, but Skyrim is the king of crafting. If I had to say one positive thing about that game, it would definitely be that. But like I said, there is a lot to like about crafting in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. Whether it's cooking or alchemy or handcrafting, they allow you to grab ingredients and just try out things. And the end result even feels very realistic. I also like that you can enhance weapons in various ways. You can socket relics and souls that you find while you're out there exploring the world into your weapons, or you can sharpen both weapons and armor. Although I can't imagine how sharpening a pair of boots works, but it sounds awfully useful if you want to kick ass. One thing that I really miss though is not being able to set camp with your own tents and bedrolls and start fires of your own and cook whenever you wish. I can't help but feel like we didn't get any of these features because the game didn't have exploration and discovery as its primary focus. But there is still time, guys. Questline, if you're listening, there is still time. And I think these features would catapult the adventure aspect of the game through the roof. Give it some thought, would you? And while you're at it, also think about giving us a stash. No, not that stash. A place where we can store our loot, or at least allow us to use the various containers in the game as, well, containers. User experience is very impressively good in this game if you consider this is an early access version. The UI is useful, lean, and its learning curve is basically non-existent. And the same is true of the gameplay itself. The key mappings and the way in which the game responds to your inputs are absolutely on point. And they made this game feel like a comfortable old shoe that felt plain nice to wear. Inventory management, trading, and crafting don't feel like a chore. And because of this, I wanted to engage in all these activities, and this is a very positive thing. If I had to level some criticism at the user experience, I would say that when you level, you only have a few seconds to press the P key to bring up your character's screen. If you take too long, you'll have to go to your inventory and then click on the character tab. And the same is true of your journal. Take too long to press the J key after you've looted a book or a letter, and the opportunity is lost forever. Or until you go to your inventory screen and click on the item you want to read. What I mean is that you should be able to access these screens through your mapped keys at all times. All in all, Kudos for delivering such a polished version of the game this early on. Sound effects and mix. Probably not a good idea to disturb him.
You're no match for our band. You're only making me angrier.
Sound effects and mix are pretty good in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. I lost count of how many times I turned around swiftly because I heard a creature approaching and managed to block its attack in the nick of time. Combat sounds are also decent and very well mixed with the rest of the audio elements. I like that even when the music gets epic and intense, the mix never comes off as muddy. The sound themselves are for the most part surprisingly diverse. An arrow impact upon a leather armor, for example, sounds different from an arrow hitting plate armor. Hammer strikes sound different from dagger stabs, and I think that's really cool. But the sounds themselves are a little bit wimpy. There could have been a little bit more gravitas to them. Also, different types of weapons make different sounds when blocked with your shield. And this is all the immersion I expect from the sound design in a game. Ambiance sounds also add to the immersion aspect of the game, and I didn't even experience some of the issues that the devs told us to expect, so there is that. Overall, I think this aspect of the game is excellent. Music. These guys know how to press the right keys for me in this department. I thought the music in Tainted Grail Conquest was beyond amazing, and while I wasn't as impressed with this one, I think it's still awesome. It takes the backseat when it has to, but it also brings out its A game for the more intense moments. The score in some of the game's creepier locations almost had me crapping my undies. The music in this game is smart, epic, consistent all the way through with the game's lore and vibes, and it cranks up the experience of the game's best dungeons up to 11. Truly awesome stuff. Voice acting.
No, but I've met other men like him. It's best not to argue with him. And if he keeps his word and gets us off this blasted island, I'll even help him get his fancy sword. I don't mind beating up some lightkeepers either.
The truth is that you can't see the captain because he's not here. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell anyone. And if I wasn't wrong about you, and I can count on your help, I'll tell you where he went. You just have to promise me that this entire charade stays between us.
It's hit or miss in my opinion, but unfortunately it leans more towards the bad, I think. In my opinion, voice acting direction wasn't great in this game, and I don't know if there was such a thing as a voice director here. But most voice actors seem to be a little bit clueless about the dramatic intention of the passages they participate in. Don't get me wrong, you can tell that these guys are pros, of course. There is some proper modulation, their voices have decent personality, but the delivery often comes off as tone deaf. And that's not the actor's fault, really. But there is something that I find endlessly irritating about the voice acting in this game. Some characters are just trying way too hard to sound like they are from Scotland or Ireland or somewhere other than Camelot. The worst offender is this guy, who is just unbearable. But the Dalriata in general sound like one of the most generic ethnic groups that I've come across in a game. And that's in part because each Dalriata you talk to has a different accent. And if you were to play the staunch advocate for this game, you'd probably say, oh, that's because there are different Dalriata tribes in the world of Tainted Grail. Yes, but sometimes people who are part of the same tribe have different accents, and they can't even agree on what their damned people are called.
The Dalriata.
Dalriata.
Are they Dalriata or Dalrita?
The Dalrita?
Make up your minds, guys. For further reference on how to do natives right in a game, check out Greedfall. Overall, while the voice acting is competent, it lacks direction, and this hurts the game in this category. Graphics. I find it curious that the game throws this disclaimer at you. This game does not aim to have AAA level graphics or polish. Are you kidding? Graphics are amazing in this game. I think both Tainted Grail Conquest and Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon punch well above their indie game weight. I don't know how these games compare to their AAA counterparts, but the art design in these games is top notch. It's consistent all the way through with the game's lore and vibes, and graphics in particular dance gracefully with their musical counterparts. Yes, character models including monsters are a bit rough around the edges, and I wouldn't say we are swimming in variety in the attire and armor department. So yes, these particular aspects might need a little bit of work, but look at this, man. This game is terrifying when it wants to. It's intriguing, immersive, and the art design is to be credited for all of this for sure. Overall, I feel graphics in this game lack a bit of the mystique they had in Tainted Grail Conquest, but I still think they are pretty freaking awesome. Performance and stability. The early access version of this game has fewer issues than the final release of many AAA games, and that should tell you everything you need to know about this one. However, I did have to start over once because my saved files became corrupted, and even after restarting, the game seemed to have the tendency to restore the wrong saved game when I loaded, and that happened when I quick saved too often. There are also a few noticeable frame rate drops, and the game sometimes freezes momentarily when it autosaves. But I don't consider any of these issues to be serious, and it seems like they can easily be fixed by means of patches. Overall, I am very impressed with how the game performs in this early access stage. Other considerations and final thoughts. Tainted Grail Conquest Me Too'd Slay the Spire, a game that is widely regarded as the best-in-class tactical card game that has the single-player camping experience as the main focus, but it also built upon the Slay the Spire formula, turning it into the core mechanic for an awesome RPG that was deeply immersive and told a great story. And I suppose Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon tried to do the same thing. Me Too, a game that is highly regarded as the best-in-class title in its ballpark, and then give the formula a couple of spins. The thing is that for me, Skyrim is not that game. It has many problems, and unfortunately, Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon also copies these problems along with the game's core formula. And while the spin the developers gave to the Slay the Spire formula in Tainted Grail Conquest resulted in a unique game, I feel like Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon does not add too much to the Skyrim premise other than its Arthurian dark fantasy setting. Damn, Alex, you have really buried this game beyond redemption, haven't you? Well, I can see why you'd be under the impression that I didn't enjoy Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon, but you'd be wrong. Save a few exceptions, I was rarely bored with the game. There is a lot to do, and most of it is actually fun. And the moments in which the game shines are well worth the price of the admission for anyone who is into RPGs. The bottom line, I suppose, is that I think Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon is worth checking out if games like Skyrim are your jam, because there aren't too many games that are this good in the open world RPG ballpark, and you've probably played all of them by now, and these are competent developers who will likely turn this into a top tier game for this subgenre by the time the game is ready for a full release. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye, everyone.